Ironically, the threat to the church's fullness comes now not from external forces of secularism, but from those within the church who, out of well-meaning but misguided desire to protect their vision of holy tradition, are taking a chainsaw to Catholicity, starting with the purge of suspected enemy scholars. Invariably, their immediate focus is on issues of sexual morality, but their attacks are ultimately an assault on Catholicity. As an illustration of this disturbing trend, I came across a long and articulate Facebook post by a senior priest in a position of leadership, pointing out the subtle dangers of what he calls academic obfuscation. And I'm going to quote this at length. I quote, "This is not a matter where someone hears or reads one sentence and then calls the bishop and says, 'This man is a heretic.' Rather, it's the persistent influence of websites and publications, I suppose, like The Wheel, Orthodoxy and Dialogue, and Public Orthodoxy, that use highly technical and academic obfuscation to begin pushing boundaries in areas where the church has been very clear. Its assertions like science is proving the church's teaching wrong on homosexual attraction, and numerous other statements that make it clear that these like-minded individuals have a much larger, more sinister agenda. They know what they're doing, and they know how to do it in such a way that it becomes difficult to pin them down. They use questions and dialogue and discussions to little by little push the boundaries so that the larger Orthodox community will accept their ideas. They do these things under the guise of academic freedom as a cover for their machinations." He goes on, "Yes, we know the names of these teachers. We know every one of them. They are being watched carefully by those of us who are like-minded and see the need to stop them. But the bishops have been far too reticent to act. There are only a few priests who have the courage to speak up, sadly. The laity needs to take a more active role in speaking out and pushing back so that such false teaching can be cleaned out of the Orthodox Church." End of quote. The point I want to underline tonight is that these sorts of relentless attacks are hacking away at the Catholicity of the Orthodox Church. They are attacking the most basic assumptions and tools for the pursuit of truth: questions, dialogue, discussions, and freedom of thought. How can the fullness of the Christian faith flourish in such a hostile atmosphere? Most troubling to me is that this militant version of Orthodoxy is being promoted by the president of St. Vladimir's Seminary. In a podcast titled "Preparing to Serve in a Hostile World," Father Chad Hatfield speaks very bluntly to students in the Orthodox interseminary movement, which represents many Orthodox jurisdictions in the United States. This talk is posted on Ancient Faith Radio from November 2020. He warns that his remarks could be controversial, but he wants students to know about the world they will be serving. He asserts that people are running away from anemic churches that aren't presenting the rigorous demands of what he calls the full gospel. The world is becoming aggressively anti-Christian, he says, and he points to the well-known Orthodox conservative controversialist Rod Dreher's books, The Benedict Option and Live Not by Lies, as essential reading for seminarians to survive and thrive in this battle against what he calls the collapse of our moral fabric. Father Chad goes further and targets the internal enemies of the church, who he says are aiding and abetting Orthodoxy's own moral collapse. They are a dangerous new movement, he says, and labels them the accommodationist movement. Again, a long quote from that podcast. The accommodationist movement in the Orthodox Church here in America is probably best known, best centered at public orthodoxy, which is part of Fordham University's fabric. It gets a lot of attention, but what does the accommodationist movement stand for? It means embracing the zeitgeist. If you don't know what that means, it's a nice German word which means the spirit of the age. Lord Acton once said, "He who weds the zeitgeist soon finds himself a widower." What are they after in the accommodationist movement? That is to dial everything down in the Orthodox world, because if you're full-blooded and present the full faith of the church, they think that puts people off. I'd say look at the example of mainline Protestant Christianity, which is in enormous, serious decline. If the accommodationist movement in Orthodoxy is following that style, then we will find ourselves totally empty, because an accommodationist church has nothing to offer an anxious world. So I'm not projecting for you a world of doom and gloom, but I am projecting the reality of what you are going to be facing. And part of being in seminary is you're toughening yourself up and you're getting ready to be the best Orthodox Christian apologist for the faith that you can find anywhere in the world, because the 21st century challenges are waiting for you. The most disturbing aspect of Dreyer's lecture was his explicit rejection of dialogue with Orthodox Christians he views as no longer worthy of conversation. Dreyer and company view engagement as contamination. Others, more charitably, feel that they don't have the time to waste on discussing what they believe to be settled principles. But in either case, whether it be from disdain or disinterest, communion is broken and the church's Catholicity is compromised. This pastor told me he would be worried if this same individualistic spirit seeped into Orthodoxy through its converts. I told him that it's already happening. In 2017, David Bentley Hart put this phenomenon front and center in his Orthodoxy in America lecture at Fordham University.
But the situation in America today is not analogous to that. Rather, Orthodoxy has become a haven for a large, if loosely affiliated, community of Christians whose expectations of their faiths have been formed as much by the traditions they've left behind as the Orthodoxy they have embraced, because quite reasonably they see themselves not as pagan converts, but as Christians moving more deeply into Christian tradition. At times, this has had something of a refreshing and invigorating effect on local Orthodox parishes and the greater community. It's also at other times, however, exercised a remarkably narrowing effect upon Orthodoxy as a presence within American society, too. And this is because many of the converts, and again, unfairly, I might say especially converts from evangelicalism, but this isn't meant as an opprobrium. I just think this is an issue of different traditions, different temperaments. Many of these converts do come from traditions that, being rather historically shallow manifestations of a fairly modern form of piety, don't have much of a concept of licit theological latitude or theological complexity. Many are accustomed to think of Christian faith as simply a uniform set of explicit beliefs, almost a catalog of propositions and susceptible to few interpretations. And merely by an accident of history, for instance, most American converts have adopted a version of Orthodox self-understanding that became dominant in the latter half of the 20th century, with good reason. I mean just the Neo-Palamite synthesis as promoted by that remarkable generation, or those generations of Russian scholars whose writings opened the world of Eastern Christian thought to Western Christians, like Losky and Meyendorff and Schwemann of blessed memory. Now, I admit that this particular approach to Orthodoxy is one that I don't think is completely adequate. I mean, I don't take its reading of the patristic tradition always to be rich and various enough, and I'm not even sure it gets Palamos entirely correct. But that's of small importance, because I say, let 1,000 flowers blossom. I may be wrong after all. It's unlikely, but it's happened at least twice. Once I didn't know the time had changed. What I think what could be disastrous, however, is if this becomes an inability of certain American Orthodox converts to distinguish between that particular rather synthetic school of Orthodoxy and Orthodox faith as such. Because then nothing else in the rich tradition of Eastern Christian thought and devotion, say the Byzantine scholastics, the Russian religious philosophers of the 19th century, and so on, let alone any movement within modern Orthodox theology that doesn't conform to that system, is granted the right to be considered Orthodox Christianity. And this has led in recent years, with the internet becoming now the place where apparently theology is done, to some fairly ferocious debates among people, as far as I can tell, live in their mother's basements, but that's it's these good souls, more than any other faction within the church, who do tend to be the most obstreperous and rigorous and self-confident guardians of what they regard as pure Orthodox. And so at times actually attacking sort of native Orthodox traditions they don't recognize, or Orthodox scholarship and theological speculation that doesn't correspond to the abstracted, somewhat attenuated view of the tradition they were taught in its propositional form. In place of the biblicist fundamentalism they left behind, some tend towards a kind of neo-patristic fundamentalism. Now, I'm not trying to be overly harsh, and I am making wild generalizations here, and every community has its share of purists and fundamentalists. In the main, they do little harm. But in the case of the Orthodox Church in this country, there is a peril that ought not to be overlooked just because we might not be prepared for it. It's in the nature of conversion that it involves not only a sincere affection from what one is converted to, but sometimes an earnest and even sometimes resentful disaffection for what one has converted from. And this can bear a bitter fruit. In the case of some former evangelicals I've known, moreover, conversion to Orthodoxy has often seemed an especially agreeable retreat to ancient Christianity precisely because they can do it without being forced to surrender something nearly as precious to themselves as their faith itself, which is a hostility towards Roman Catholicism.
And now this new Orthodox individualism has a Russian twist. Sarah Riccardi-Swartz, in her study of American converts to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, describes the post-Soviet anti-Western ideology that is fueling the traditionalism of American converts, who see the Russian Church and the Russian state under Vladimir Putin as a bulwark against Western secularism. Father Alexander Schmemann taught that the church changed in order to remain the same. But it was this ability to adapt to new situations and challenges that often also resulted in schism with the most conservative groups, who were gradually left behind. This was the case of those who opposed the new Trinitarian formulation as unbiblical, or who objected to calling Mary the Theotokos. But it was also true of the Novatianists in the 3rd century and Donatists in the 4th to 6th century, who broke communion with the rest of the church, not on theological grounds, but for being too lax towards sinners. These rigorists resisted the tide of pastoral compassion that swept through the wider church as it sought to deal with the thousands of Christians who had compromised or lapsed during times of persecution. The discipline of the church, says Pelikan, was obliged to deal with violations of unity and love, as well as with violations of faith and doctrine. Sadly, in their rigidity, the traditionalists eventually found themselves on the wrong side of both history and the church's tradition. In his book, Theology of Wonder, Bishop Seraphim Sigrist agrees that we Orthodox, at least in our patristic tradition and liturgy, do indeed have a sense of divine vastness and mystery. But he says, this wholeness is more often praised than manifested. There is a crisis of imagination in the church today, he says. And with this has come a loss of the cosmic dimension. Yet he also says this loss can be recovered by reclaiming the way of our negative theology, with its emphasis on the limits of our knowledge, and therefore the need to leave space for multiple interpretations. I would add that this sense of wonder, boundlessness, and mystery applies equally to human beings, as created in the image and likeness of God. This was a point emphasized by Boris Vysheslavtsev, died in 1954, one of Florovsky's, Verhovskoy's, Meindorf's, and Schmemann's teachers and colleagues at St. Sergius Institute in Paris before they immigrated to the United States. Vysheslavtsev says this: God dwells in unapproachable light, quoting 1 Timothy, but man also discovers in his own depths an unapproachable light. This is the ultimate sublime mystical element in his likeness to God. God is transcendent, and I myself am transcendent. God is mysterious, and I myself am mysterious. There is a hidden God and a hidden man. We have a negative theology that points to the ultimate mystery of the deity. There should also be a negative anthropology pointing to the mystery of man himself. End of quote. Awareness of the limits of our knowledge goes hand in hand with awareness of the possibility of eternal progress in knowledge from glory to glory, in St. Paul's words. Bishop Seraphim says, the essential point of eternal progress is that God's creation and what we see in Jesus is not simply cyclic opening up and enfolding, but something different, an endless opening out. When we confess in the creed that the Church is Catholic, we commit ourselves to wonder, mystery, cosmic immensity, and to accepting with humility the limits of our present understanding of all truth, human and divine. And because of that humility, we can be open to new knowledge, new insights, multiple interpretations, and the possibility of eternal growth in life and faith and spiritual understanding, as the Divine Liturgy says in the second prayer of the faithful. I'd like to focus on the essay by Edith Humphrey, because she offers a constructive way to move forward in the body of Christ. Her article is titled, Fundamentalism, Not Just a Cautionary Tale. And she says the simple but painful path of engagement begins with listening. This conclusion comes after a very useful analysis of the problems surrounding the term fundamentalism and of a too swift dismissal of its alleged adherents. Both sides, she says, need to abandon polarization and listen more. Quote, rigorists need Irenicists and vice versa. It's tough to do this. Staying together and staying engaged with each other while continuing to have substantive disagreements is uncomfortable. And the temptation is to either avoid and run away or run roughshod over the other. But without this effort, our vaunted Orthodox church life becomes a tribute to individualism and not Catholicity.
Paula DeSore asks, the fullness of Catholicity should include a wide range of views, but are there limits? What are they and who sets them?
Yes, I mean, as the point I made about the Apostle John and Paul, and not even to eat with such a one. Somebody is creating limits. But my point is that you don't want to do that prematurely. And who is it? Ultimately, it's going to be councils of the church that look at first of all, bishops in their pastoral discretion and discernment, but it's a back and forth process. As I said, you can point to councils that made decisions that were wrong. John Chrysostom was condemned and exiled. You can all along the line, you can point to quote mistakes that were made by high ecclesiastical personages and by entire councils. So it is a time also when you look back and say, we made a mistake back then. I don't think that's one of the points I think that Florovsky was trying to underline, that we don't have an external criterion for these kinds of things. And although there are limits, these things get tested and they get experimented on as human experience evolves, but it's not a clear path, as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Paul, for that question. I think it really is important, if we're worrying about people who are being too rigorous, for us also to be concerned about those who are going beyond bounds that have been recognized by the church through the centuries. And so I want to thank Paul for that. Thanks also, Father John, for backing off the term fundamentalism, though it is in your title and has attracted many people. Quite evidently, it's a great crowd here. When you were quoting me from my paper, you paid attention to mostly to the polity, that I suggest that we need to have one to the other during a time of polarization. And I think that's really important. But I also think that what I was trying to do in that paper is to suggest that the term fundamentalism is not useful for application either to Orthodox or to a Catholic, in the terms of Roman Catholic rigorists, because the fundamentalists were concerned for looking to the bare essentials of the faith and to declaring what the fundamentals are. and rigorous in Catholic and Orthodox circles tend to try to see many things as essential, to be expansive rather than reductionist. And so you get a lack of differentiation between those things that are that have been believed everywhere and at all times, and those things that are more local, that are held very dear to some people. And so I think that the term is inaccurate academically. I also worry about it because it's been used, of course, politically and ideologically, simply to refer to anyone who's more conservative than I am, and who I'm afraid might be frightening, because we also attach the term to those groups that would be prone to violence, and that's not just a insinuation that's been picked up from the press and the use of the term ideology in, say, the last 25 years. It's also something that's actually built into some studies. For example, Appleby's study on fundamentalism. The idea is, okay, fundamentalists in the United States don't tend to be, unless they're transplants from some other culture, don't tend to be violent, but given the chance they would, because that's their mindset. So when we use that term, we're evoking a whole gestalt, a whole constellation of ideas that are loosely linked to true fundamentalism, very loosely linked in the beginning of the 20th century, and that have kind of developed through the ages. And we're using a very powerful term that is a term of approbation. And I think it's a mistake for us to be continuing to talk this way if we really want to consider where we differ with others within our own fellowship. We need to talk about the substance of the issues and not try to explain a whole series of differences by means of a phenomenon or a so-called sociological movement that really can't be well defined. So I find the term itself very, very problematic, and I don't think that it casts much light on the situation. So, you know, at the end, you pull back from using the term, and I really appreciate that. And actually, throughout your whole term, your whole talk, you talked, Father Gillian, of rigorous. But I think that then the question would be, what behavior do we consider to be rigorous and actually destroys Catholicity, destroys the pleroma?
My main point, Edith, my main point is yeah. These are exactly the points that need to bring people together to talk about these things. And it's when a group decides that I am not going to talk with you, you are not worth the time, you're a waste of time, that's a problem. For me, that's the undermining of Catholicity. And for me, that's when I call it fundamentalism. If once you decide that this other Orthodox person who is in their Orthodox church, they're receiving communion, they have the approval of their bishop and all of that, but you've decided that you are not going to talk to that group, that's a problem. Because these issues, you know, okay, questions of moral life, these are complicated new issues, absolutely new issues in the history of humanity, at least as we've experienced it. So my point is trying to get people to not prematurely exclude other fellow Orthodox from this kind of discussion, which may go on for a very long time. So you're I agree with you. I'm agreeing that I don't want to prematurely label people either, but you need to bring people together and not decide I'm going to stay in one corner, they're going to stay in another, and that's it.
My topic today is agreeing to disagree. This topic is central, in fact, to the witness of the New Testament. St. Paul, 3 different times, speaks about the necessity to respect another's conscience and not to make an issue about non-essential issues in the church where there are disagreements. He talks about this in Romans 14, in 1 Corinthians 8, and in 1 Corinthians 10. It was a big deal then, and it's a big deal now. In fact, it would surprise me if it was as big a deal then as it is now, although there were certainly lots of serious issues that our brothers and sisters in the apostolic church disagreed about. For goodness sake, even the apostles struggled with this. In those texts, St. Paul is very clear that he had an opinion, he had a conviction. He wasn't saying by agreeing to disagree that there was not a position that was from God. He called people who held certain positions the strong and people who held certain positions the weak. And he made clear his own position on a number of matters in those texts. So don't get me wrong and don't misunderstand the apostolic injunction that you're going to hear in just a second. Agreeing to disagree doesn't mean that the issues aren't important or that there isn't a correct position. It's simply pointing out that correctness is not the end all of things, and that you can be correct about something, but in the means of holding that correction, you can really sin against your brother and against Christ. It's not so much in these matters to be correct as it is to be loving. Of course, he's not talking about dogma. He's not talking about the gospel and the Orthodox faith. He's making a distinction between that which must be believed by all Christians to be saved, the apostolic, the Catholic and Orthodox truth, and those matters which are important, but we can live with disagreement on. And now, what exactly are these areas in which we can agree to disagree? I'm going to not comment upon the issues that were pressing in the early church that Paul himself was addressing. You heard some of them. The observance of certain holy days, eating food sacrificed to idols, etc. Instead, I'm going to throw out quite a few things now that are certainly troubling us in our day. I want to also remind you that on every one of these issues, I myself have a conviction. I have an opinion about what is right and what is the mature Christian understanding of this and what the scriptures teach. But I also am suggesting that there are areas for legitimate disagreement in which those who are strong and have the mature opinion can agree to accept with kindness and without constantly bombarding the weak with a need to change, can accept opinions that are elsewhere, and that we, as the body of Christ, ought be able to embrace one another with kindness and mutual tolerance without making an issue of these things. Don't expect to agree with everything I'm going to say, as are areas of legitimate disagreement, but consider them. The style of education for your children, homeschooling, private schooling, charter schooling, some combination of the same. Cleanliness, exactly how clean does a person need to be a responsible, loving Christian? Do you have to shower every day? Do you have to flush the toilet every time you use it? What exactly are those standards of cleanliness? Punctuality. Not everyone who is German or Anglo-Saxon on this subject. And is that a big deal? Privacy levels, gun ownership, gun usage, hunting, war, video games, movies, exactly what movies are reasonable and legitimate for Christians to see. Vegetarianism, is it worth considering or not? Western medicine, rules, exact rules of courtship and dating. What exactly is permissible in dating? Jewelry, can it be worn? Can women wear earrings? What about nose rings? Tattoos. Oof. Modesty. The exact standard of modesty. Hairstyles. Public health care. Is it legitimate? Gene therapy. Stem cell therapy. Homeopathy. The use of antibiotics. Sports. Can we play collective sports? Corporate boycotts. Are they wise for Christians to engage in? Secular music. Halloween. Sunday activities after liturgy. Boxing. Can you watch MMA? Driving an SUV. Literature that you read. Can you read Harry Potter? Tithing. Debt. Obesity. Santa Claus. Drinking. Smoking. Child discipline. Social media. Politics. And the gradation of our political concerns. What's most important? Activism. Sidewalk counseling. Pro-life work. Sit-ins around abortion clinics. Card playing. Byzantine versus Russian four-part music. The church calendar, old versus new. And yes, vaccination. Now remember before you get yourself all worked up. I'm not saying that there's not a correct opinion on all of these things. I'm not saying that you shouldn't care about these things. Not at all. St. Paul is not telling the strong not to do that. What I'm saying is, I'm suggesting that these are areas for consideration, that they are non-essentials, that they are areas that we should exercise great love and forbearance over. And our main focus should be on accepting each other and maintaining our peace as Christ has accepted us. Maybe in that context of mutual acceptance and non-judgmentalism, those who have strong, well-formed opinions will have a context in which the whole church can mature and move from weak to stronger. May God, by his Holy Spirit, grant to us all this spirit of mutual acceptance for the sake of Christ who has accepted us. God be with you all.
My question is an historical one. You focused very much on what could be called the convert phenomenon. I myself am a convert, and I came in the early 90s, right when I suppose really things became, kind of really opening up. But the fundamentalism thing is not just something that you see in North America. You see it across global orthodoxy, and one thinks of various different forms of it in the Church of Greece, for example, which I know you know so well. One thinks of it in the Church of Russia. I would even say that elements of it have taken over some of the policies in the Church of Russia. So I'm wondering, why it comes in different forms. Is there something of an historical sea change that happened after 1991? The sorts of fundamentalism that you tended to see prior to that date were quite different. They tended to be, the sort of thing that arguably you see in ROCOR, a more traditional kind of ethos. What you see today is quite different. Why historically across the globe?
I wish I could say, and maybe one of the sociologists among us, would be able to have a better answer about that. I'm not sure. Today I see Edith is going to have a question as well. She talked about the largest group, at least coming into the church, the Orthodox Church in North America, seems to be coming from evangelical backgrounds, and they do find partners with. Russian Orthodox, some expressions of Russian Orthodoxy, and in Greece as well. I don't know what the sociological explanation is. Why now? How in different parts of the world? And maybe someone else can answer that more adequately.
And in my experience, it's actually not people born into the church. It's people who came to it usually running away from something and thinking that they finally found what they've always been looking for, only to be to suffer cognitive dissonance because what they found isn't exactly what they thought it was.
yes, people will often say, if you touch upon issues that have sort of been addressed already decades ago in those other communities, right? And people have fled to Orthodoxy to escape perhaps those issues. That's true. Very often I will be told, oh, you don't know what that leads to because we've been through that back in whatever church they were in, and we know what that leads to, and that's like, well,
That's like error 101 in logic. That's not the way logic works.
right.
We are about as orthodox as it gets.
There are some people within the church that call me a traditionalist in that sense, because I do affirm Byzantine music and some other aspects of the church. And
it's very easy to be frustrated with these kinds of things. My own experience, whenever I've met someone who, whenever I have actually met someone or conversed more carefully with someone who takes this kind of position, they are typically a person who is coming to this from some kind of history of spiritual or personal trauma. And they just tend to react in rather aggressive ways for a variety of reasons. And, as difficult as these personalities can be sometimes, it's also, we're all part of the church, we're all part of God's creation. And, to the same way that I would encourage them to be more flexible and loving and understanding, I think we have to take the same approach with them.
Oh yeah, I have nothing against the mentally ill, George. Don't get me wrong. I will only love.